I think we should play the video now, Mr. Whitmore. I nodded to my father's attorney, Michael Brennan, as we stood before the assembled mourners in the chapel. The projector hummed to life, casting its cold light onto the wall behind my father's casket. Emily, my wife of 12 years, shifted uncomfortably in the front row, her black dress immaculate, her eyes still red from the performance she'd given at the gravesite. Beside her, my younger brother Scott dabbed at dry eyes with a handkerchief that had belonged to our father. Before we proceed with the reading of Harold Whitmore's final will and testament, Michael announced, the deceased requested that this recording be shown to all present. I watched their faces change as the video began. First confusion, then recognition, then horror. "He's wiping your mouth while I'm in your bed," Emily's voice rang out from the speakers, crystal clear and unmistakable. God, what a fool. Scott's laughter followed. "You know Dad's going to leave it all to Danny Boy unless we do something." My father's face had been expressionless when he'd first shown me this footage 3 weeks ago. Mine was the same now as I turned and walked toward the chapel doors, letting the evidence speak for itself. Behind me, Emily's strangled gasp pierced the shocked silence. Scott was shouting something, excuses, denials, but 2 board members of Whitmore Industries were already blocking his path to the exit. I stepped outside into the bright spring afternoon, leaving chaos in my wake. 6 months earlier, I'd been the picture of contentment. If not happiness, then at least satisfaction. At 42, I had built what most would consider a good life, a successful career as CFO of my father's company, a beautiful home in the suburbs, and a marriage that, while not exactly passionate after 12 years, seemed stable and reliable. Emily was the kind of wife who remembered birthdays, hosted dinner parties, and charmed clients. We'd met when I was 30, at a charity auction my father had sponsored. She was 26, intelligent, ambitious, and beautiful, with auburn hair and a smile that seemed to hold secrets. I was never quite sure why she'd chosen me. I was dependable rather than dashing, solid rather than spectacular. But I'd been grateful for her presence in my life. "You're my rock, Daniel," she used to say, curling against me on Sunday mornings. I'd believed her. Being someone's foundation had always seemed like a worthy goal. My father, Harold Whitmore, had built Whitmore Industries from nothing, turning a small manufacturing plant into a regional powerhouse. He was a self-made man who valued loyalty above all else. "Always know who has your back," he would tell Scott and me when we were boys. In business and in life, that's what matters. I'd spent my life trying to be worthy of my father's trust. When my mother died when I was in college, I'd come home every weekend to make sure he wasn't drinking too much. When the company faced a financial crisis in 2008, I'd worked alongside him for 18 months straight, 7 days a week, to keep it afloat. Scott had always been different, charming, quick-witted, and restless. He moved from department to department within the company, always with a new idea, rarely with the patience to see it through. Dad indulged him. Scott was the spitting image of our mother, and that counted for something. He was appointed Vice President of Business Development, a position created specifically for him, with just enough responsibility to keep him engaged, but not enough to do serious damage. "Your brother needs structure," Dad would say, "but he also needs room to breathe." I never questioned it. Family was family. When Dad was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer last fall, the doctors gave him 6 months. I immediately took unpaid leave from my CFO duties to care for him, moving into the guest house on the family estate to be closer during his final days. "You don't have to do this," Emily had protested. "We can hire nurses. That's what your father's money is for." "He's my father," I'd replied simply. "This isn't about money." Looking back, I should have noticed the signs. Emily's increasing absence, her sudden interest in spending time at the main house to help with arrangements, Scott's newfound dedication to visiting Dad several times a week when he'd barely made time for monthly dinners before the diagnosis. But I was busy administering medications, consulting with doctors, and trying to make my father comfortable. When I wasn't doing that, I was running the company remotely, making sure everything stayed on track in my absence. I trusted my wife. I trusted my brother. That was my first mistake. The subtle signs accumulated like snowflakes, seemingly harmless until they formed an avalanche. First, it was Emily's new perfume, something spicy and unfamiliar that she never wore around me. Then, the hushed phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered a room. I found her engagement ring left carelessly by the bathroom sink 3 times in a single month. She who had once been paranoid about losing it. Scott began showing unusual interest in the company's financial statements, requesting copies of documents he'd never cared about before. He started attending board meetings he'd previously skipped, asking pointed questions about succession plans and emergency protocols. "Just picking up the slack while you're taking care of Dad," he explained with an easy smile when I questioned him. "Someone has to keep things running." One evening in February, I returned to the guest house unexpectedly after Dad had fallen asleep early. Emily's car was in the driveway, but she wasn't in the main house where she claimed to be organizing Harold's papers. I found her jacket thrown over a chair in our bedroom, but no Emily. When she returned an hour later, flushed and slightly disheveled, she claimed she'd been taking a walk around the property. "The fresh air helps me think," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "This has been such a difficult time for all of us." That night, I lay awake beside her, listening to her breathing and wondering when the woman I married had become a stranger. Dad's health declined rapidly after that. The hospice nurse, Marion, began staying overnight, allowing me brief respites to shower and change clothes. It was Marion who first voiced what I had been too exhausted to see. "Mr. Whitmore," she said one morning as we drank coffee in the kitchen, "I don't mean to overstep, but I've been in this field for 20 years, and I recognize patterns." She hesitated before continuing. "Your brother and your wife, they spend a lot of time together in the East Wing when they think everyone is busy." I stared at her, not wanting to understand. "Your father has noticed too," she added gently. "He asked me about it yesterday." That afternoon, I found Dad more alert than he had been in weeks, his eyes clear despite the morphine. "Danny," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to show you something." He gestured weakly toward the tablet on his bedside table. With trembling fingers, he pulled up a video file. "I had Brennan install cameras," he explained, after Marion told me what she'd seen. I watched in silence as the footage showed Scott and Emily in the guest house where I'd been staying, in our bed. The timestamp showed it was from 3 days ago, during the 2 hours I'd spent at the office catching up on urgent paperwork. "He's wiping your mouth while I'm in your bed," Emily laughed, her naked body pressed against my brother's. "God, what a fool!" Scott kissed her neck, his expression smug. "You know Dad's going to leave it all to Danny boy unless we do something." "That's why I've been working on Harold," Emily replied. "Poor old man, so worried about his legacy. I've been suggesting that Scott has matured during this crisis, that maybe it's time to consider a more equitable distribution." "And?" Scott prompted. "He's thinking about it. I found him reviewing his will yesterday." I couldn't breathe. The tablet slipped from my hands onto the bed. "I'm sorry, son," Dad whispered. "I needed you to see the truth." I looked at my father, skeletal now, his once powerful frame ravaged by cancer, and felt something break open inside me. Not just my heart, but something deeper. My faith in the order of things. My belief that loyalty would be rewarded, that family meant something sacred. "What do you want me to do?" I asked finally. Dad's eyes hardened, a glimpse of the formidable businessman he had once been. "Nothing. Not yet. Let me handle this one last thing for you." "Dad?" "Trust me, Daniel," he interrupted. "I've called Brennan. He'll be here this evening." That night, my father signed a new will with steady hands, a final act of love and justice from a dying man. For the next 3 weeks, I maintained a perfect facade. I continued caring for my father during the day and sleeping in the guest house at night, though I made sure Emily and I were never there at the same time. I cited Dad's increasing need for care as the reason I was spending nights on the couch in his room. Emily seemed almost relieved by this arrangement, offering token protests that didn't reach her eyes. Scott increased his visits, always finding reasons to pull Emily aside for discussions about funeral arrangements that left her with flushed cheeks and mussed hair. I watched them like an anthropologist observing a foreign culture, detached and analytical. In those 3 weeks, I learned that my entire marriage had been a calculation on Emily's part. She'd married the responsible brother, the one poised to inherit, while keeping the door open with the charming one. She'd played a long game, and I'd been too busy being dependable to notice. The night Dad died, I was holding his hand. His breathing had grown labored around midnight, and by 3 a.m., Marion had called me from the main house where I'd gone to shower. I made it back in time for his final moments. "Remember what matters," he whispered, his last words before slipping away. I sat with him until dawn, my grief a physical weight pressing against my chest. When I finally called Scott, his voice on the phone was thick with sleep, and not alone. I could hear Emily shushing someone in the background before the call disconnected. They arrived at the main house separately, 40 minutes apart, both dressed in appropriate morning attire. Emily tried to embrace me, but I stepped back, keeping my face neutral. "I'm sorry," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "I know how close you two were." The performance was flawless. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed she cared. That was the moment I knew what I had to do, not just for myself, or even for my father, but for justice itself. As Emily reached for my hand, her wedding ring catching the morning light, I made my decision. There would be no confrontation, no messy scene, no desperate attempts to salvage what was already dead. Instead, there would be consequences. Cold, calculated, and complete. "I need some time alone," I told her, my voice steady. "Can you handle the immediate arrangements with the funeral home? Brennan will be here this afternoon to discuss next steps." "Of course," she replied, squeezing my arm. "Whatever you need." What I needed was to destroy everything she had worked for, everything she and Scott had plotted to steal. I would do it methodically, precisely, and without mercy. That afternoon, I met with Michael Brennan in his office downtown, away from curious eyes and listening ears. "Your father was very specific about how this should be handled," he explained, sliding a folder across the desk. "The new will has been properly executed and witnessed. It's ironclad." I skimmed the document, nodding slowly. Dad had been thorough. The family estate, Whitmore Industries, stocks, investments, trust funds, everything was to go solely to me. Scott and Emily were specifically disinherited, with language citing actions unbecoming and harmful to the family legacy. "And the video?" I asked. "As requested, it's been preserved as evidence and prepared for projection. Your father was—" Brennan paused, choosing his words carefully, adamant that the truth be revealed publicly. I considered this. Dad had always believed in handling things directly. No whispered scandals, no rumors, just clean, surgical exposure of lies. "There's more," Brennan continued, pulling out another document. "Your father took the liberty of contacting Patrick Sullivan at the board." Sullivan was Whitmore Industries' longest-serving board member and my father's closest friend. The company bylaws allow for immediate removal of officers found to be acting against company interests. Patrick has the votes lined up to remove Scott the moment the video is shown. I raised an eyebrow. Even dying, my father had been 3 steps ahead. "And what about Emily?" I asked, my voice clinical. Brennan slid another folder toward me. "Divorce papers, already drafted. Given the evidence, she won't be entitled to any of the marital assets under the infidelity clause in your prenuptial agreement. Additionally, your father suggested that a restraining order might be appropriate given the calculated nature of the betrayal. I nodded, turning the pages. Everything was in order. Clean, precise, like surgical incisions. "There's one more thing," Brennan said, reaching into his briefcase one last time. He withdrew a letter, sealed with my father's personal wax stamp. "Harold asked me to give you this privately. His instructions were that you should read it before making your final decision about how to proceed." Back in my car, I broke the seal and unfolded my father's letter, recognizing his firm handwriting despite the slight tremor visible in some of the lines. "Daniel, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I want you to know that the pride I feel in the man you've become has been the greatest joy of my life. What Emily and Scott have done is unforgivable. The betrayal cuts deeper because it comes from those who should have honored the bonds of family and marriage. You have every right to your anger. But revenge, son, is a poison that can corrupt even the purest heart. I've laid out a path for justice, not vengeance. The difference may seem semantic, but it's crucial. Justice restores balance. Vengeance destroys the scales entirely. Whatever you decide to do with the evidence and the will, remember that your actions will define the man you become in the aftermath. Choose to be someone your children and grandchildren will be proud of, even if you haven't met them yet. You've always been the quiet strength of this family. Now, you must be the quiet strength of your own life. With eternal love and faith in you, Dad." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my inner pocket, close to my heart. My father was right, but not in the way he intended. There would be no screaming, no public confrontation, no messy emotional scene, just the cold, hard truth, revealed at precisely the right moment. My phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "Funeral arrangements complete. Service Friday at 2. Reception after at the house? Call me when you can. Love you." The audacity was almost admirable. I texted back a simple "thank you" and began to finalize my preparations. The day of the funeral dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed to mock the solemnity of the occasion. I dressed carefully in the suit my father had given me for my 40th birthday, making sure everything was impeccable. Emily had spent the night at her sister's, according to the note she'd left, promising to meet me at the church. I knew Scott had been with her. His car had been parked 3 blocks from her sister's house, visible from the coffee shop where I'd sat watching the previous evening. The church filled quickly. My father had been respected in the community, and the pews overflowed with business associates, friends, and extended family. In the front row sat the Whitmore Industries Board of Directors, solemn in their dark suits. Emily arrived early, taking her place beside me with appropriate gravity, her hand seeking mine. I allowed the contact briefly before standing to greet arriving mourners. Scott arrived last, sliding into the seat on Emily's other side just as the service began. He leaned over briefly to embrace me, a show of brotherly solidarity in grief. I returned the gesture mechanically, feeling nothing but the ticking clock in my mind. The service proceeded according to tradition. People spoke of my father's business acumen, his generosity, his larger-than-life presence. I delivered a brief, dignified eulogy that focused on his values: honesty, loyalty, and justice. As I spoke, I watched Emily and Scott exchange discreet glances, no doubt calculating their imminent windfall. After the burial, everyone gathered back at the chapel for the reading of the will, a somewhat old-fashioned tradition my father had specifically requested. Brennan stood at the front, manila folder in hand, while a small table nearby held a laptop connected to the projector. "Before I begin," Brennan announced, "Harold Whitmore left specific instructions about the order of proceedings. First, there is a video he wanted shared with all of you." I watched Emily's expression shift from appropriate grief to confusion as the laptop screen came to life. Scott straightened in his seat, a muscle twitching in his jaw. The footage began playing, crystal clear, unmistakable. Emily and Scott in the guest house bed, their naked bodies, their contemptuous laughter, their scheming laid bare for everyone to witness. "He's wiping your mouth while I'm in your bed," Emily's voice rang out. "God, what a fool!" The shocked gasps around the room built to a crescendo as the conspiracy unfolded. Emily tried to stand, but her legs seemed to give way. She collapsed back into her seat, her face drained of color. Scott lunged toward the projector, but Sullivan and another board member blocked his path. I stood and walked toward the exit, my steps measured and calm. Behind me, Brennan's voice continued, reading the new will with clinical precision. I didn't need to stay for that part. I already knew what it said. Outside, I took my first deep breath in weeks. The weight hadn't lifted, not entirely, but something had shifted. The truth was out. There was no going back. My phone began buzzing immediately. Board members, family, friends, distant relatives. I silenced it and drove to the office. There was work to be done. By evening, Scott had been officially removed from his position at Whitmore Industries. Security had already packed his belongings and changed the access codes. The board voted unanimously to support my leadership, with Sullivan personally pledging his confidence in my vision for the company's future. Emily found the locks changed when she tried to return to our home. A courier delivered the divorce papers to her sister's house, along with a letter from my attorney explaining that her belongings would be packed and delivered to a storage facility of her choosing. The letter also detailed the evidence of her infidelity and conspiracy, making it clear that the prenuptial agreement's infidelity clause was being enforced in full. When she tried to access our joint accounts the next morning, she found them frozen pending legal proceedings. The credit cards were canceled. The car she drove, registered in my name, was repossessed from her sister's driveway before noon. I didn't do any of this myself. I had a team of highly competent professionals handling each aspect, allowing me to focus on taking control of the company and honoring my father's legacy. My revenge wasn't in causing pain directly. It was in removing my betrayers from my life so completely that they ceased to exist in my world. 3 months after my father's funeral, I sat in his former office, now mine, reviewing the quarterly reports. Whitmore Industries was thriving under my leadership, with 2 new contracts secured and a strategic acquisition underway. I had donated a significant sum to establish the Harold Whitmore Cancer Research Fund at the University Hospital, ensuring that my father's name would be associated with hope and progress rather than scandal. Scott's downfall had been swift and comprehensive. After his removal from the board, investors who had committed to his pet project pulled their funding. The startup he attempted to launch afterward failed to attract serious interest. His reputation was too damaged, his connections lost. Last I heard, he was living in a rented apartment across town, working for a former competitor in a mid-level sales position. The bankruptcy filing hit the local business news with a small notation on page 4. Emily's fall had been equally dramatic. The video had spread through our social circle despite Brennan's best efforts to contain it. The charity where she'd been offered a director position rescinded the offer, citing character concerns. Her friends, most of them gained through her position as my wife, distanced themselves one by one. When she attempted to confront me at the office 2 weeks after the funeral, security escorted her from the building. The restraining order was filed the same day, citing harassment and emotional distress. She contested the divorce, of course, but the evidence was irrefutable. The judge awarded her nothing beyond the few possessions she'd brought into the marriage. Last week, I'd heard she'd moved back to her hometown, living with her parents at 40. They reportedly refused to fund her legal fees for any further challenges to the divorce settlement. Her social media accounts had gone dark after a final, desperate post, accusing me of cruelty and vindictiveness. The comment section had been merciless. I should have felt satisfaction, perhaps even happiness, at how thoroughly my plan had succeeded. Instead, I felt something quieter. a sense of restored balance. Justice, not vengeance, just as my father had written. That evening, I left the office early and drove to the cemetery. The headstone had been installed the previous week, elegant black granite with a simple inscription, Harold Whitmore, beloved father, honorable man. I placed a hand on the cold stone. "It's done," I said quietly. "Everything is as it should be." In my pocket, I carried my father's letter, worn now from repeated readings. I had become the man he believed I could be, not through rage or overt destruction, but through the calm, implacable force of truth and consequence. As I walked back to my car, my phone rang. It was Sullivan. "Daniel," he said when I answered, "I know this is forward, but my niece is in town next weekend. Brilliant woman, neurosurgeon, just finished her fellowship at Johns Hopkins. Would you consider having dinner with us on Saturday? No pressure, just thought you might enjoy the conversation." I hesitated, surprised at the invitation. It had been months since I'd thought about anything beyond work and settling my father's affairs. "That would be nice," I heard myself say. "Thank you." As I drove home to the quiet house I'd once shared with Emily, I realized something had changed. The betrayal would always be part of my story, but it no longer defined me. I had survived it. I had overcome it. And now, perhaps, it was time to begin again. My father had been right all along. Knowing who has your back is what matters in business and in life. Sometimes that person has to be yourself. And so, we've reached the end of today's story. Was it what you expected, or did it take a twist you didn't see coming? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below, and let's get a conversation going. If this story kept you hooked, make sure to hit that like button. And if you're new here or just haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time to join our community. I bring you fresh, captivating stories every day, so click that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.